Work expands so as to fill the time available for its completion. If you've spent any time researching the productivity space, this is probably a quote you've heard at least once. It describes something known as Parkinson's law, and it's something that has a tremendous amount of relevance to the world of personal finance. Today we're going to be discussing what Parkinson's law is when it comes to personal finance, why we might fall victim to it, how to break it, as well as the impact that breaking it can have on our financial future.
But before we get going, be sure to like this video if you haven't already, as it really does help out the channel a lot, and subscribe with notifications on for more money-related videos like this one every single week. And if you want to further support this channel, you can check out some of the links I've left in the description below, which includes a link to the investing platform M1 Finance. Get started investing for free today.
So as I said, today we're going to be discussing Parkinson's law, which traditionally refers to the phenomenon that work required to complete a task will swell to the point that it fills up all the allotted time given for the task's completion. Basically, it describes how we can hyper-focus on the tiny details that, in the grand scheme of things, aren't really all that important, simply because we don't feel the urgency of an impending deadline. Or in some cases, it just describes our tendency to procrastinate, but I'd argue that also comes from a lack of urgency in many cases. When it comes to personal finance, Parkinson's law makes a similar observation, except instead of the work required to complete a task swelling to fill the allotted time, it's our expenses that expand to fill the amount of income that we generate. In essence, what it's describing is our tendency to lack a sense of urgency in our financial lives, especially when it comes to those larger but further away goals like saving for retirement. As a result of this lack of urgency, we can often ignore, or at least fail to make the most of, important aspects of building a strong financial foundation, such as regularly tracking our expenses and budgeting, automating decisions that we may screw up if our willpower were to fail us at an inopportune moment, or simply having a well thought out contingency plan and priorities that we stick to. Instead, what we often actually do is more or less float through our financial lives. This doesn't necessarily mean that we aren't making any financial progress. It doesn't mean that we are racking up mountains of credit card debt, but it certainly does mean that we're probably not making the most of what we have. And that matters in the real-time strategy-esque game that personal finance can often resemble. Simply due to the miracle of compound interest, if you get off to a really good start financially, you have much more wiggle room down the road than you would have otherwise, which is something you tend to be really grateful for when life inevitably throws you some curveballs or you happen to spot a great opportunity. Still, this experience of floating through our financial lives, at least to some degree, is one that I'm sure many of us can relate to, at least at some points in our lives. So that raises two questions. First, why do we so often find ourselves falling victim to Parkinson's law? And second, how can we go about breaking it so that we can start to make some real financial progress? The answer to the first question is going to vary from person to person. However, I think one of the biggest reasons we fall victim to Parkinson's law is simply how our psychology is wired. While there's still a lot we don't yet know about how early humans lived, we do know enough to gather that their long-term planning requirements were not the same as what we have facing us today. Society was not as complex and interwoven as it is now. As a result, human beings did not evolve to be particularly long-term thinkers. In our hunter-gatherer days, the extent of our long-term thinking requirements may not have often stretched much beyond planning out food and job allocations within our tribe over the next couple of seasons. And the very idea that we would need to plan for something like retirement that wouldn't even start for 4 or 5 decades was nigh on unthinkable. Heck, the 401k, which is often seen as one of the moments where responsibility for retirement planning was shifted from the corporation to the employee — remember, pensions used to be much more common for employees than they are today — only came about in 1978. That's barely 40 years ago. So in the grand scheme of things, they're a very new invention, one that many of us are still adapting to. But the fact that we're psychologically wired to naturally seek out short-term gains more than long-term payoffs tend to work against us a lot when it comes to personal finance. Things like giving in to impulse purchases when we know we probably should be saving more for a retirement that won't actually start for another 40 years is just one example of that. But if that's the case, if our psychology is working against us in this regard, what can we do about it? We know that this is something we need to overcome if we're going to be successful financially. So how do we break Parkinson's law? Thankfully, we have a lot of options at our disposal. Today, I'll lay out 3 of them that I found to be particularly useful. The first is setting limits and automating your decisions to ensure that you stick to them. This reverse budget-esque approach essentially solves for the willpower conundrum. As we all know, even if we may not like to admit it, consistently making good decisions when faced with tempting alternatives is difficult. And the more we have to use our willpower and self-control to make these decisions in a short period of time, the harder it is to persevere in consistently making the right choice while resisting each successive temptation. While more research is needed to discover the root cause of this phenomenon, it has been supported time and again in many studies. One of the more famous ones, conducted by Roy Baumeister in 1998, had one group of participants try to resist eating sweets for an extended period of time before trying to solve some difficult puzzles in order to see whether or not resisting the temptation to eat the sweets affected their ability to keep going when the going was tough. The studies have found that compared to a control group, the will to keep trying was noticeably diminished. So while it is important to set realistic limits for ourselves so that we're able to save money, it's also important that we supplement that with as much automation as we can so that we don't become our own worst enemy by crippling our own financial success in a moment of weakness. A second way that we can break Parkinson's law is reframing the situation or goal that we're striving towards. As I said, one of the reasons that we fall victim to Parkinson's law is that we lack a real sense of urgency when it comes to some of our financial goals. And if we're being honest with ourselves, that is an entirely understandable feeling to have, especially with the large and far off goals like retirement. I mean, there are so many things that we have to deal with every day in life. And saving money for retirement, while certainly a lot easier to take care of if we get an early start due to the miracles of compound interest, is still doable even if we get a late start. It'll just require us to either save more money later on in life at the expense of the urgent things that are still coming up every day at that point, or it'll require us to earn higher returns to make up for the difference, which is quite a bit less in our control, but still technically possible if we're fortunate. But that's us viewing the situation in terms of time urgency. In other words, this bill that I just got in the mail, which is due in 2 weeks, is by definition more urgent than a retirement that's 40 years away. Instead, we can reframe the situation in terms of some other type of urgency. For instance, when it comes to saving money for retirement, we could look at it in terms of effort-related urgency. As I said, if you get a late start when it comes to saving for retirement, you can still achieve your goal. You'll just need to save a lot more money than you would have otherwise while still handling the day-to-day minutia that comes up, because that stuff certainly is not going to be going away anytime soon. That is certainly doable, but if we're struggling to make that balance work today, how likely is it that it'll be any easier in the future, when we'll need to be putting more of our budget towards saving than we would if we figured out how to make it work to start with today? It's going to take a lot more effort and be less probable to succeed. Probability of success related urgency could be another option for reframing the situation. So that's the basic idea. You try to reframe the situation in such a way that you develop that sense of urgency for goals that you actually want to work toward, but aren't right now because they don't seem very urgent. That's how you get your psychological quirks to work for you and not against you. Now, how specifically you end up reframing the situation will likely come down to whatever works best for you on a case-by-case basis. So some experimentation and patience with yourself will probably be required, especially at first as you get to know yourself and what motivates you better. But that's the general goal with this technique. A third technique that we can utilize to avoid falling victim to Parkinson's law is to establish contingency plans and priorities from the offset, communicating them with partners or significant others if applicable. This one is pretty straightforward. It really just comes down to figuring out what you really want and thinking through how you'll react to certain undesirable events or stumbling blocks that might come up on your road to getting there, so that you're less likely to make suboptimal decisions due to panic or exhaustion when life throws you curveballs, as it always does eventually. Beyond these techniques, you can also work on developing other financial habits like asking questions relevant to the situation, such as, is this product or service a good value for the money? Or how much will this really cost me in total, as opposed to how much will it cost me per month? You could also take control of your environment by removing temptations from your space, so as to make it less likely that you'll fall into a trap you'd rather avoid. This could come in the form of something as simple as blocking certain websites that tempt you into making purchases that you later regret. You'd be surprised how many people do that. It's very simple, but having that one extra step to go through is often very effective at curbing those impulse-related temptations. But with that being said, I wanted to wrap this video up by running some numbers with you to show you just how much of a difference breaking Parkinson's law can make on your finances. Motivational speaker and author Brian Tracy was once quoted as saying, "Here's a rule of thumb that will almost guarantee that you become wealthy over the course of your working lifetime. Save and invest 50% of any increase you earn in your salary for the rest of your career. You can spend the other 50% of the increase on improving your standard of living, but resolve today to save half of every increase for the rest of your career. This discipline alone will ensure that you achieve financial independence, and probably several years before you expect." And you know what? He wasn't wrong. Let's assume that John and Jane are making about $60,000 a year between the two of them, and they're saving about 15% of that, which is a pretty standard recommendation given by many financial experts. If, on average, they received annual raises of 3% and saved half of that, then they would end up with a net worth of approximately $4.85 million after a 40-year working career, assuming a long-term average return in line with that of the S&P 500 of about 10% per year. During that same time frame, their annual expenses would have risen from approximately $51,000 to about $92,500. According to the 4% rule, this suggests that they would need to have about $2,312,500 put away in order to be considered financially independent. They would have hit that mark in year 33. Pretty sweet, huh? So that's how Parkinson's law can wreck your finances if you don't find a way to break it. Thankfully, as we just went over, there are a myriad of things we can do to avoid falling victim to the worst effects of this law. Arguably, what it all comes down to, though, is finding a way to make our psychological quirks work for us and not against us, which is something we have to do in the world of personal finance, and life in general, all the time. So whether you're currently struggling with Parkinson's law or not, there's a lot to be learned from it.
But that'll do it for me today. Once again, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to smash that like button if you haven't already, subscribe, and hit that bell next to my name so you'll be notified of all my future uploads. I generally upload every single Monday, and if you have a friend that would be interested in this kind of content, be sure to share it with them. Let's really get this information out there and start our own financial revolution.